Okay, imagine this. A mystery, like centuries old. A letter from a 17th century nun, and the rumor is it was dictated by the devil himself.
Right.
And for over 300 years, nobody could crack its code. Like the best minds tried.
Mm.
Now get this. A science center claims they've finally deciphered it using an algorithm they found on the dark web.
Yeah, it sounds like something straight out of a movie, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But that's exactly the story we're getting into today.
We are doing a deep dive into this really fascinating, sometimes pretty unsettling story of Sister Maria Crocifissa della Concezione's Lucifer letter.
Absolutely. It's a story that makes you question, well, a lot of things. Reality, sanity, where these kinds of messages even come from.
Exactly. So our mission today for you listening is to kind of unpack the facts as presented in our source material. It's an audio piece called Lucifer Letter from 17th Century Decoded via Dark Web, spooky.mp3.
And that piece itself pulls from, established news sources like the London Times, Times of Israel, so it's building on reported information.
Right. We'll look at the legend itself, the controversy around this decoding claim, and then we want to kind of zoom out, look at the bigger ideas this brings up: hidden knowledge, control, maybe even the nature of reality itself.
And we want to help you, our listeners, sort of grasp all these different angles and implications without it feeling, too overwhelming.
Let's dive in. Where does this all start?
Okay, so we have to go back to 1676, Sicily, Palma di Monte Chiaro, Benedictine convent.
Huh?
And there's this nun, Sister Maria Crocifissa della Concezione.
Okay.
Story goes, she fainted one day. When she woke up, she found 3 letters beside her.
Just appeared?
Apparently. And her claim was pretty dramatic. The devil wrote them using her hand. Automatic writing.
Wow. Okay, automatic writing from the devil. That's quite a claim. And what happened to these letters?
Well, only one of them actually survived all this time. That single letter is now kept at the Ludum Science Center, also in Sicily.
And this is the one nobody could read.
Exactly. For over 3 centuries, the source says 314 years. To be precise, scholars, code readers, they were all stumped. That's a remarkably long time for a code to remain unbroken.
Definitely. Which makes the recent claim even more interesting, or maybe controversial.
Very controversial. So the Ludum Science Center, they announced they'd cracked it.
Yeah.
And how? They said they heard, and this phrasing is interesting, via little bird, about some software.
Like secret software?
They believe it's software used by intelligence agencies for code breaking. And they apparently found it on the dark web.
Okay, finding Intel-grade code-breaking software on the dark web to read a 17th century nun's devil letter. That's quite a setup.
It is. And their method involved feeding the software different ancient languages. They called it priming it.
What?
Ancient Greek, Arabic, the runic alphabet, and Latin. The idea was to see if the letter was some kind of complex cipher using these known languages.
And the director of the center, Daniele Bette, he actually told the Times of London their goal was to show that it was really devilish.
Right. But here's what the scientists, or researchers, reportedly concluded.
What did they say they found?
They concluded it wasn't exactly devilish per se. They said it was a jumble of languages that Sister Maria likely composed herself.
Herself? How?
They argued she must have become a skilled linguist during her time in the convent, learned all these languages, and they suggested maybe she wrote it in some kind of state of delusion, possibly linked to schizophrenia. That's the theory they put forward.
Okay, but hold on. That raises a huge question for me. If she was just a skilled linguist who knew these languages and jumbled them up, why did it take 314 years and a supposed dark web algorithm to figure that out?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It seems inconsistent. If it's just known languages jumbled, shouldn't linguists or cryptographers have spotted patterns much, much earlier?
Exactly. It feels like there's a piece missing there. But okay, putting that aside for a second, what did they say the decoded message contained?
Well, despite concluding it was likely her own writing, they did release excerpts that sound pretty intense.
Like what?
Lines like, God thinks he can free mortals.
Okay, provocative.
Another one. The system works for no one.
The system works for no one. That's quite a statement.
And it also apparently describes God and Jesus as dead weights.
Dead weights, wow. Yeah, the source describing that as pretty dark, anti-Christ, anti-life, and anti-freedom. That seems about right.
Definitely.
So if we take that line, God thinks he can free mortals, if the devil supposedly said that, what's the implication? That mortals aren't free, that we're trapped in some way.
That's certainly one interpretation, yeah. It opens up this whole can of worms about control, freedom, the nature of the system it mentions.
And Abie, the director, he stuck with the idea that Sister Maria wrote it, maybe due to her linguistic skill plus schizophrenia.
That seems to be the main theory pushed in the initial reports, yes. Combining her known abilities with a possible psychological condition.
But the content itself, regardless of who wrote it, really pushes us to think about these bigger concepts, right? Like adversarial figures.
Yeah, exactly. The source brings this up. Lucifer, Satan, Beelzebub. Are they all the same guy? Or different? Some ancient texts actually treat Beelzebub as a distinct entity.
Interesting. And then there's the connection made in the source between Satan and Saturn.
Right. Saturn viewed as this controlling planet, an archetype almost. The idea presented is that Saturn offers great treasures, power, whatever, but only if you stay in the castle, metaphorically speaking. If you work for Saturn, Satan.
So a kind of Faustian bargain idea linked to a planetary archetype. And this control is seen where?
The source mentions observing this influence in Hollywood, in media. This notion of a controlling structure behind the scenes.
And linking back to the letter's message, the system works for no one. Could that be the system they're talking about, this Saturnian control structure?
It's a connection the source invites us to consider, definitely. And it ties into this really profound idea about thought and creation.
How so?
The idea that we can actually influence or even create reality with our thoughts, our intentions. The source mentions Kabbalah or Kabbalah.
Right, the mystical tradition.
Yeah, presenting it as a way of, quote, turning letters into reality. Using vibrational frequencies, essentially, as formulas to create matter. It's described almost like experimental math beyond calculus.
Wow. So the implication is, if you understand these principles, these formulas...
You could potentially break out of a system that feeds off of you. That's the idea explored. Moving from being controlled to being a creator.
That's a powerful concept. Shifting from pawn to player, basically. Gaining agency within whatever this system is.
Precisely. It reframes power entirely. And it also leads into ideas about decoding things beyond just written text.
Yeah.
Like subconscious messages or even external influences.
You mean like reverse speech?
Yeah, the source touches on that. The practice of recording speech and playing it backward. Sometimes you get gibberish, but other times apparently you get messages that are spot on or sometimes even satanic.
Right, I've heard of that. The big question there is always, is that your own subconscious bubbling up? Or is it something else?
Exactly. Is it purely psychological, or, as the source posits, could it be an entity that's found a way to latch on and speak through you? An interviewee mentioned in the source leaned towards the psychological explanation.
Still creepy either way. And what about other entities? The source mentions serpent beings.
Ah, yes, drawing from Thoth and the Emerald Tablets.
Ah.
These archonic serpent beings, not literal snakes necessarily, but representing energies, influences that can control people, often without them even knowing it.
And how do they operate, according to this view?
They're linked to things like blood sacrifices, wars, rituals, industries that profit from, quote, dark ecstasy. This archonic serpent formula is seen as embedded in industries, religions, media archetypes.
A formula. Like a predictable pattern.
Kind of. Enabling those who understand it to maybe forecast events, even access something like the Akashic Records, the sort of cosmic library of all knowledge.
That's getting deep. And how does this connect back to the letter itself?
Well, the source points out that some individual characters in the Lucifer letter resemble sigils. Sigils. Symbols used in magic or esoteric practices.
Sigils like spells to summon things.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Symbols believed to call upon these deities or entities. Which raises another question. Could someone like Sister Maria doing automatic writing, or even an artist creating something intuitively, unknowingly be creating sigils and summoning things?
Whoa. That's a chilling thought, that the symbols themselves have power regardless of intent.
The source notes similarities between some characters in the letter and known magical alphabets from Western mysticism and esoteric traditions. It adds another layer of possibility to what the letter might represent.
Okay, so we have the official story of the decoding, the linguistic analysis, the psychological theories, and then these deeper, more esoteric interpretations involving sigils, entities, control systems. It's a lot to juggle.
It is. But just when you think you've got all the pieces, there's another twist regarding the decoding itself.
Oh, what now?
Remember the Ludum Science Center claimed they decoded it?
Yeah, with the dark web algorithm, found the jumble of languages.
Well, someone found a post on the center's own Italian Facebook page. And the translation of that post tells a very different story.
Different how?
First, it calls the letter's characters incomprehensible. Still.
Wait, incomprehensible? After they told the Times of London they'd decoded parts of it?
Exactly. And it describes the original 1676 event differently, too. Not as her writing from the devil, but the devil trying to force her to write a specific message,
What message?
demanding God treat men as devils and deny God's mercy, essentially. But according to this Facebook post, Sister Maria resisted.
How?
Despite threats, she only managed to write one single comprehensible word, Oheim, amidst all the demonic characters still indecipherable today.
Still indecipherable today. This is from their own Facebook page.
Apparently so. It even mentions a prize being offered for translation, which implies they hadn't solved it.
This completely contradicts the news reports.
And here's the real kicker. The Facebook post reportedly ends with the line, "Our cryptography software is working on us. We will let you know."
Working on us. We will let you know. That sounds like they haven't finished. Or maybe hadn't even really started in earnest when the first story broke.
It strongly suggests the decoding was, at best, ongoing and unverified when they made the initial claims to the press. Or perhaps the initial claims were exaggerated.
So the chilling excerpts they released, God thinks he can free mortals. Dead weights. Where did those come from if the letter is still indecipherable?
That is the massive inconsistency. It throws the whole decoding narrative into serious doubt. Was it a PR stunt? A misunderstanding? A deliberate misdirection? We don't know.
Wow. Okay, so the mystery of the letter itself is actually deeper now than before the supposed decoding.
It seems that way. It forces us to really question the source of information, even when it comes from seemingly official channels. Who controls the narrative?
And it ties back into those bigger themes of control and manipulation we were just discussing. The source material mentions another perspective from a previous guest named Marlino.
Yes, referencing his views. Apparently, he believes figures like the Elohim and the Anunnaki, often discussed in ancient astronaut theories, are essentially the same group.
And their role.
According to this perspective, they are manipulators of man, genetic manipulators even. The idea is that tweaks were made in original texts, like the Hebrew transcripts used for the Bible,
For what purpose?
to manipulate the entire history of mankind. Basically, setting up control mechanisms, using neurolinguistic programming, creating false realities.
That's a heavy concept, manipulating foundational texts to control history and reality itself.
It ties back into that Saturn-Satan archetype discussion, too. The rings of Saturn are brought up as symbols of control imprisonment.
Imprisonment how?
Like a structure, almost like being caught in a mafia network, as the source puts it. Something that limits freedom, maybe even drains the soul.
That sounds bleak. The source also draws a parallel to something more modern, right? The 27 Club.
Yeah, that phenomenon in the music industry, where several famous musicians died at age 27, the source notes the observation that sometimes, tragically, an artist's death leads to increased record sales.
Raising questions about whether there could be manipulation, even exploitation, for profit within that system.
Exactly. It's using that as an analogy for how these larger systems of control might operate, benefiting from loss or limitation.
So, faced with all this potential manipulation, controlling forces, conflicting information, what's the takeaway? Are we just stuck in this system?
Well, the source doesn't necessarily paint a picture of complete hopelessness. It talks about these adversaries, like Saturn, Satan, as maybe being cogs in a much larger, ginormous wheel.
A wheel, like a cycle.
Yeah, part of a cyclical infinite system. This existence from that viewpoint might be like a boot camp or even a prison, depending on your perspective. A place of learning, perhaps intense learning.
And within this boot camp, there are forces working against life.
The source uses the term anti-organic forces. It gives the example of companies like Monsanto, characterizing them as anti-life, anti-organic, profiting from the demise of organics, operating on anti-organic frequencies.
So, it's not just about spiritual or cosmic control, but tangible real-world systems that might work against natural balance.
That's the connection being made. And the crucial thing in this view is maintaining balance. If a system becomes too imbalanced, say 90% negative, 10% good, it could consume itself.
So the advice is,
Not assimilate to these anti-organic lifestyles. A reference is made to Star Trek, not assimilate to the Borg. Basically, maintain your individuality, your connection to what you perceive as organic or life-affirming. Keep the balance.
that makes sense. Don't get absorbed by the potentially destructive aspects of the system. Stay fluid.
Exactly. Fluidity is key. The source quotes Thoth again from the Emerald Tablets. Angles are finite, circles are forever.
Meaning straight lines, rigid paths, they end. But circles, cycles, fluidity, that's sustainable, infinite.
That's the interpretation offered. Avoid getting locked into destructive, finite ways of being or thinking.
Which requires discernment, being aware.
Absolutely. The call is to keep our eyes, ears, minds open. But critically, use discernment. Use your judgment. Draw on your previous experiences to make better decisions as you navigate all this.
And the source links this to déjà vu.
Yeah, suggesting that feeling of "I've been here before" might actually be true, in a sense. Maybe you have been there before, in this life or another, facing a similar crucial decision point.
Like a chance to not repeat a mistake within this, what is it called, simulation, time reality matrix, time space, chaos system code.
Yes, all those rather evocative terms, suggesting reality might be more complex, maybe even cyclical or programmed than we usually think. Deja vu could be a marker within that system.
This reminds me of another legendary text mentioned, the Devil's Bible, the Codex Gigas.
Ah, yes, that enormous medieval manuscript supposedly written by a single monk in one night, with help from the devil, according to legend. And it famously includes a large illustration of the devil.
Another instance of questioning authorship, automatic writing, hidden influences.
Exactly, and how these legends can fuel temptations, the lure of quick power, fame, like maybe becoming a Hollywood director by worshiping the devil, as the source somewhat provocatively puts it.
It brings up that classic selling your soul theme. The source mentions the song Hurt, originally by Trent Reznor, famously covered by Johnny Cash.
Right, exploring themes of regret, empires built on questionable foundations, maybe addiction versus a literal deal with the devil. And Reznor's other work, songs like Capital G or The Hand That Feeds, also touches on ideas of a world stage, control, and maybe humans being treated like zeros and ones in a system.
Which brings us back to a fundamental question. What are we in all this? Do we have a soul? Consciousness?
The source definitely leans into the idea that, yes, humans, maybe even plants, possess consciousness, a soul. It talks about a divine spark that's perhaps even above the soul, manifesting through the connections of mind, body, soul.
And there was a personal experience shared in the source material
Yeah.
about the Holy Spirit.
Yes. Someone describing a deeply physical sensation tingling, hair standing on end as a validation. A feeling that confirms, for them, that there are indeed two sides to existence.
And therefore, a need to be mindful of our choices.
Precisely. The quote was something like, "Be careful which side we choose because we may be there for a long time," implying choices have lasting consequences, perhaps beyond just this life.
It sounds like a continuous process. Even if you reach a next level, the work isn't over.
Not at all. Referencing Thoth again, the journey requires constant awareness, fluidity, ongoing expansion of mind, consciousness, spirit, soul, and importantly, appreciating our physical body too.
As an incredible software packet.
Yeah, the vehicle that allows us to experience and learn within this reality, however strange it might be. Time itself is framed as perhaps infinite, maybe just a theory or purely perception.
So wrapping this all up, the story of Sister Maria's letter, it started as this historical curiosity, this centuries-old puzzle.
Right, a nun, a convent, a supposed message from the devil, a baffling code.
But then the dark web decoding claim, and especially the contradictions found on their own Facebook page, it just blows the whole thing wide open.
It really does. It becomes less about what the letter says, since we can't even be sure it was decoded, and more about the process, the claims, the conflicting narratives.
Yeah, it becomes a case study in information, belief, and maybe manipulation. It really forces you to ask, who gets to define what's devilish? Who controls the stories we hear?
And crucially, how much power do we have individually through our own discernment to navigate all this complexity, to sort truth from fiction, or at least make informed judgments?
That feels like the real takeaway here. The letter is the hook, but the questions it raises about reality, control, and our own awareness are the deep dive.
Definitely something for you, the listener, to think about. As you encounter information every day, online, in the news, wherever, how do you apply discernment? How do you decide what rings true? What stood out to you from this whole strange tale?
Lots to chew on.
Indeed. And before we sign off, just a quick word from our sponsor. If you're looking for something to support energy, focus, and digestion, we really recommend checking out GI Joy over at getthetea.com.
Yeah, it's got great stuff in it. Organic colostrum, aloe, turmeric probiotics, peppermint. Good for clarity, energy, gut health.
And it's pretty affordable, too, about $37 for what lasts most people around 2 months. So getthetea.com, check out GI Joy.
All right, be excellent to each other.
Be awesome and amazing to each other.
And remember, be the change you want to see.